Joining me now for an important update on the critical moral issue of human trafficking in Canada is Derek Ross, Executive Director and General Counsel of Christian Legal Fellowship. Thank you for being with us today, Derek.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're so honored to have you join us and to give us insight on this very important issue. In the landscape of Canada, people might not think human trafficking is a prevalent issue here. They might not actually understand what human trafficking looks like in our nation. So can you tell us a bit more about this issue in Canada and what does it look like as it takes hold of our people and our nation?
For sure. Well, and as you said, there is a lot of misconception and confusion about what human trafficking is and what it looks like. A lot of us associate it with forced abductions and confining people and imprisoning them and transporting them internationally, and certainly that does happen, although that's more what we would describe as human smuggling. When we talk about human trafficking, what we're talking about and what the criminal code is targeting is coercing or controlling another person's movements to try to exploit them for some purpose, often for forced labor or in relation to the sex trade. And as you mentioned, this is a concern here in Canada. This isn't just an international issue. The federal government has, since 2012, started collecting a bit more data and statistics about crimes related to human trafficking in Canada. And since 2012, there have been almost 4,000 police-reported incidents of human trafficking in Canada. And that has involved over 3,000 individual victims of people in Canada who have been victims of human trafficking. So it's a big concern, and it's something that's happening right within our borders.
It certainly is, and some of the statistics are so alarming. 96% of people trafficked in Canada are women and girls, and they're often experiencing sex trafficking. When you think about the danger and the reality that marginalized women and young girls who are often coming from really difficult backgrounds, difficult life experiences, and being preyed upon to go into sex trafficking, not even understanding what's actually unfolding around them in those moments. What are some of the legal issues you see unfolding in Canada right now connected to human trafficking and sex trafficking?
Well, there's a lot of issues, and one of the big issues is that human trafficking can sometimes be difficult to detect because it isn't always super obvious that someone has been a victim of this type of exploitation, precisely because it's often psychological and emotional manipulation and coercion. So what often happens is an individual might be specifically targeted, even by someone that they know, who is reaching out with the pretense of caring about them, sometimes pretending to want to have a romantic relationship with them. And so there's even a name for this. They call it the boyfriend method, because the trafficker pretends to be a person's boyfriend, but is then lavishing gifts on them, but then making that targeted person feel indebted to repay those gifts. And feeling pressured to do certain things that they don't really want to do to earn their trafficker's love or affection. Sometimes they're being supplied with drugs and the trafficker is relying on that dependency. And then the individual is in a very vulnerable position where they feel trapped. And they might not be physically trapped, but they're psychologically and emotionally abused and manipulated and being forced to do things they don't want to do and feel they have no choice but to do them. And unfortunately, that's often in connection with the sex trade.
It's interesting, Derek. I think back to many years ago when I was a youth pastor, and there was a young girl who came to me and literally described the experience of being groomed by someone who pretended to be her boyfriend and got her into sex trafficking. And so what you're describing is very real, and we need to be on the lookout and be aware and how to protect those in our society that would be preyed upon for this kind of thing. Something that we see happening are the laws in Canada. There are different court cases coming forward, cases connected to the Supreme Court of Canada, which Christian Legal Fellowship you've been working on. Can you tell our viewers a bit about what's happening in the legal landscape connected to human trafficking and sex trafficking in Canada?
For sure. And so it's important for people to recognize that there are laws that exist specifically to combat this type of exploitation. It is a crime to engage in human trafficking in Canada, but because it's difficult to detect, it's also important, and our government has taken steps to target not just trafficking per se, but the sorts of conditions that create a demand for human trafficking. And in Canada, one of the biggest demands for human trafficking is the sex trade. And so what Parliament has done is said that in order to eliminate human trafficking, We want to eliminate the demand that objectifies and commodifies the bodies of women and girls and treats them as something that can be purchased and bought and sold. And so what Parliament has done is pass a piece of legislation called the Protection of Exploited Communities and Persons Act, PSEPA. And it basically makes it a crime to purchase sexual services from another person. And it also makes it a crime to profit from the prostitution of another person. That law, though, is being constitutionally challenged by individuals who have been charged under the law. They argue that it limits the freedom of people who might want to voluntarily participate in prostitution. But some courts have already recognized that that's a very difficult distinction. The Ontario Superior Court recently concluded that many, if not a majority, of women and girls in prostitution are there as a result of manipulation or coercion or even trafficking, and that there's a clear link between sex trafficking and the sex trade in Canada. So at the Supreme Court of Canada, Christian Legal Fellowship will be arguing that this law is important and that it is not a violation of charter rights. It actually protects the charter rights of those who rely on its protection in order to be free from this type of exploitation.
Because essentially lifting that law will allow those who are perpetrators of pursuing, sex acts, it would allow them to not be prosecuted for that. That's
one of the concerns.
Right?
Now, the counter argument is that they could be charged under other provisions of the criminal code. But again, what Parliament has said is that prostitution as a system is inherently exploitative.
Of women often, too.
Particularly of women and girls. Yeah. And I should say, too, of those statistics that we mentioned earlier, those 3,000 victims, the statistics reveal that 1 in 4 of those are under the age of 18. So 1 in 4 victims are children of human trafficking in Canada.
Well, thank you, Derek, for what Christian Legal Fellowship is doing to press into this very important issue and to protect Canadians by, advocating that this law is not changed at the level of the Supreme Court of Canada. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And it's a privilege. And that's the beauty of our country, is that we can participate in the democratic process and appear before courts and argue on behalf of those who have been marginalized.
Yes. And Derek, for our viewers watching right now, what can they do to help support this advocacy work that CLF is doing?
For sure. Well, it would encourage them to check out our website, christianlegalfellowship.org. We have a lot of information about these issues, to consider supporting our work and praying for our work. And I would say as well, for those maybe that are concerned that someone they know or love might be a victim of human trafficking, there are resources for them as well. There's a hotline, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, that people can call for support, to help individuals who might feel trapped, to know that they aren't trapped. There's hope for them, and that there are opportunities for them to escape these types of conditions.
Yes, and we need to be praying for that for those
Absolutely.
Who are trapped in that situation within Canada. Derek, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for all you do for God's purposes for this nation.
Thank you for having me, Lara.
Well, the issue of human trafficking and sexual exploitation in Canada is such a pressing concern, and we ask that you would put it on your prayer list, along with the specific case that Derek is working on connected to the Supreme Court of Canada. And if you are a victim of human trafficking and you need help, please call this confidential and toll-free number 1-833-900-1010.